The gavel came down before Selim even crossed the room. No bidding war. No hesitation. Just a single nod from a man with gold eyes and 3 faces, and the deal was done. Done. Like settling a debt nobody bothered to tell him existed. The room smelled like old money and new lies. Every seat in that private hall was filled with men who never raised their voices because they never had to. Crystal glasses sat barely touched. The lighting was low. Not dim enough to hide anything. Just low enough to make everyone comfortable watching. Selim kept his chin level. Not proud. Not broken. Just present. That was all he had learned to offer. Presence without sound. Existence without protest. He was 22 years old. Mute since birth. And according to every document his father, Darnell Voss, had ever filed, infertile, unmatched, and functionally worthless to any serious bloodline. The word his father used in private was liability. He stopped flinching at it around age 16. The hall wasn't what he expected. When Darnell told him to dress formally 3 days ago, Selim assumed it was another political dinner. Another night of standing in corners, being overlooked, being the living proof that even powerful families produce mistakes. He didn't expect this room. He didn't expect the way the men looked at him. Not with hunger, not with cruelty, but with the flat, calculating focus of people making decisions about weather patterns and crop yields. He was a variable. Nothing more. Darnell stood at the front table, dressed in his best charcoal suit, silver at his temples catching the chandelier light. He looked the way he always looked in public, composed, polished, completely in control. His hand moved across the paper without shaking. He signed it without looking up, without looking at Selim. And that small, deliberate absence of eye contact was the moment Selim's chest cracked open somewhere quiet. Not loudly. There was no gasp, no stumble. Just a fracture, thin as a hairline, running from his sternum to somewhere behind his ribs where he still kept the last few pieces of something that used to feel like hope. He had always known his father didn't love him. He hadn't known his father had planned this. The difference mattered. The 3 men across the room stood as one. Identical height, identical blonde hair, cut sharp and worn like a statement. Identical jawlines, but their eyes weren't the same. The one in the center held Selim's gaze with something between patience and calculation. The one on the left glanced at the paperwork. The one on the right hadn't looked away from Darnell once. Selim had heard of the Hale triplets. Everyone had. Aurelius, Caden, and Silas Hale, the Alpha King and his brothers, weren't a rumor. They were a fact the entire social order organized itself around. They didn't attend events like this, which meant this wasn't an event like this. Aurelius, the center one, the king, stepped forward and accepted the document from Darnell's hands. Their handshake lasted 3 seconds. Firm. Mutual. Business. Selim stood 8 feet away and watched his father complete the transaction. Nobody explained anything to him. Nobody had to. He understood. Not every detail. Not the full shape of whatever was happening. But the core of it, the transaction of it, was obvious. He had been handed over. Not in exchange for money, not in the traditional sense. There was no open auction. No crowd chanting bids. This was private. Quiet. And that made it worse, somehow. A loud auction would have felt accidental. This felt chosen. He was escorted toward the side door by a man he didn't recognize. Selim moved without resistance. What would resistance look like? A scene? A note? He carried a small pad and a pen in his breast pocket at all times, the only voice he had, but writing a protest in the middle of this hall would have been like shouting into a wall of glass. It would make noise. It would change nothing. He passed within 3 feet of his father on the way out. Darnell didn't turn. Then, just before Selim cleared the doorway, he heard it. Low, barely breath. Meant for the man standing beside Darnell, not for anyone else. If this works, we win everything. Selim's feet kept moving. His face stayed flat. But his mind stopped completely. Win everything. Everything. What exactly was his father trying to win? and what exactly had just been sacrificed to win it. Hi viewers. Have you ever had someone in your life smile at you while making a decision about you that you didn't know was already made? Drop a yes or a no in the comments. Because what Selim just experienced is about to change every single thing that comes next. The car door closed behind him. The city moved past the tinted windows. And somewhere behind him, in that quiet room full of important men, his father was still smiling. The estate appeared through the fog like it had always been there. Like the land itself had rearranged to accommodate it. No gates at first, just road, then tree line, then suddenly walls. Stone. Old. The kind of old that didn't come from age alone but from intention. Every corner deliberately kept. Every surface maintained without looking maintained. Power that didn't need to announce itself. Selim sat in the back seat of the vehicle and watched it approach. The driver hadn't spoken once during the 2-hour ride. Not one word. The partition between them stayed up. The radio stayed off. He had spent the entire drive with his notepad open and nothing written on it. Some thoughts were too large for a page. The car stopped at the main entrance. Not the side door. Not the service entrance. The front. That surprised him. A staff member opened his door. A woman in her 40s, dark complexion, silver streak in her locks, no expression giving anything away. Her name tag read Vera. She moved with the calm precision of someone who had stood in this exact spot for a very long time. She did not smile. She also did not look at him the way he expected. No pity. No curiosity. Something else, something closer to recognition. As if she had been waiting, specifically, for him. That didn't feel like comfort. He was shown through the main corridor, up a wide staircase, and into a room on the east wing. Large. Clean. A window that ran floor to ceiling faced a courtyard below. Real furniture, not minimal staging. A desk. A bookshelf. A wardrobe already stocked. He hadn't brought anything. Someone had prepared for his arrival before his arrival. He stood in the center of the room and turned slowly. No locks visible on the door. But that didn't mean they weren't there. He'd learned not to trust what he could see. 3 hours passed. No one came. He sat at the desk and watched the courtyard. Groundskeepers moved below in clipped, efficient patterns. 2 men he didn't recognize crossed the far path, speaking in tight clusters, heads angled toward each other. Not casual conversation. Something being handled. Then he noticed the security. Not obvious. Not uniformed guards standing at attention. Subtle positioning. A man near the east hedge who didn't move for 40 minutes. A woman at the far corridor window who appeared twice, each time at the same angle, scanning the same quadrant. This wasn't standard household security. This was response-level presence. Something had changed recently. Something about his arrival had changed it. He was still processing that when the door opened. All 3 of them walked in together. Aurelius first, then Caden, then Silas. In the hall, they had felt distant, almost architectural, like figures in a painting. In this room, they filled space differently. Heavier. More real. Caden glanced around the room briefly, assessing. Silas stopped near the door, arms loose at his sides, watching Selim with open, unblinking focus. Aurelius moved to the chair across the desk and sat down without being asked, like the furniture had been waiting for him specifically. Nobody spoke. Selim reached for his notepad. Aurelius reached for one first, his own, already open on the desk, and slid it across. Written in clean, deliberate print. "You are not a prisoner here." Selim looked at it, looked at him, picked up his pen, wrote, "That depends on what you need from me." Aurelius read it. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not surprise, not amusement, but something closer to attention, like a dial turning up one notch. He wrote back, "Do you know why you were really brought here?" And there it was. Not a welcome, not an explanation. A question lobbed back at him before he even had ground to stand on. Selim's pen hovered. He wrote, "My father called me a liability." Aurelius stared at the page. Then he looked up, directly, no detour, and held the eye contact long enough that the room got quieter around it. He picked up the pen. He wrote one line. He turned the notepad around. You weren't purchased. A pause. You were positioned. Positioned. The word sat in the air between them like something dropped from a height. Selim read it twice. Not because he didn't understand it the first time, but because understanding it once wasn't the same as knowing what to do with it. Caden had drifted to the window. Silas still hadn't moved from near the door. Aurelius sat across the desk with the stillness of a man who had learned long ago that patience was a sharper tool than pressure. Selim wrote, For what purpose? Aurelius turned the notepad again and wrote without hesitation. There is a faction within this court that has been moving against us for 14 months. Quietly. Through financial positions, through legal instruments, through strategic marriages and quiet removals of people who ask the wrong questions. He underlined the next line. They are very good at operating in the middle space between visible and invisible. Selim read every word carefully. Then he wrote, And I'm relevant to them because, Aurelius responded, Because you arrived. That was it. Just that. Selim stared at it. Felt the edges of something forming. A shape he couldn't fully see yet, but could feel the outline of, the way you feel a door in the dark before your hand finds the handle. He wrote, My presence triggered something. Aurelius, immediately. Selim, before I even knew what was happening. Aurelius, yes, a beat. Selim wrote slowly. So whatever my father told you I was useless, infertile, below value, that was useful to you. Aurelius didn't write back right away. He looked at the page, then at Selim. Then he wrote, Your perceived worthlessness made you the safest option available. No one in that faction would have moved to protect you. And no one would believe we valued you, which means they would not have anticipated what we could learn by watching how they responded to you. Selim set his pen down. Sat with that. The worst insult of his life, the one that had been used against him since childhood, repeated by doctors and family members and whispered at dinner tables and scrawled on legal assessments. His uselessness had been the exact thing that made him useful to the most powerful men in this court. That truth had two edges. One was almost funny, the other cut. He picked the pen back up. Wrote, Am I bait? Aurelius looked at the question. Did not answer immediately. The silent, casual dress acceptable. Open floor. Which meant no rules about who approached whom. Which meant anything could happen. Selim was brought in without introduction. Not a dramatic entrance. Not a side entrance either. He walked in with Vera at his left and no escort beyond that. Aurelius was already at the far end of the room in conversation with two advisors, back angled slightly toward the door, as if he hadn't tracked Selim's entrance. But he had. Selim knew he had. The room was large. Marble floors. High ceilings with dark wood beams. Natural light from tall east-facing windows. 30, maybe 35 people in clusters across the space. Old wealth mostly. The kind of faces that had been painted in portraits before they'd been photographed. Selim moved to the right side of the room. He found a position near the far wall, close enough to be present, far enough to observe. Took 11 minutes. The man who crossed the floor toward him didn't rush. That was deliberate. Rushing would have looked reactive. He moved at a steady, unhurried pace, glass in hand, a smile that was technically present but had no warmth inside it whatsoever. His name, Selim would later learn, was Royce Calloway. Late 50s, gray at his temples, broad in the shoulders, a face that had spent decades practicing the expression of a man who was simply asking questions. I don't believe we've been introduced, Calloway said. Selim met his gaze and said nothing. He reached for his notepad. Calloway watched him write with an expression that didn't change. Mute, Calloway said. Not a question. Not unkind either, which was somehow worse. Just a fact being filed. He looked at the note Selim had written. Selim Voss. Voss. Calloway repeated the name like he was tasting it. Darnell's boy. He tilted his head slightly. The one that was... He paused, then smiled again. Unmatched. That word. still had an edge after all these years. Selim kept his expression level. "Interesting that you're here," Calloway said, glancing across the room toward Aurelius, then back. "Aurelius doesn't typically bring personal acquisitions to gatherings like this." Another pause. "Makes one wonder what function you're meant to serve." Selim wrote, "I'm here to observe." Calloway read it, and laughed. A quiet, private laugh, the kind that wasn't meant to be shared. "Observe." He repeated it slowly. "Yes, I imagine you are." He moved on. No further words. No scene. Just that smile and those words and the way he walked back across the floor looking exactly the same as when he arrived. Selim watched him go, looked across the room. Aurelius had not moved, had not intervened, had not acknowledged the exchange by even a glance in Calloway's direction. Left him there, in full view, without a word of backup. The cracks that Selim had been careful not to let form started shifting. 2 hours later, the reception ended. 3 hours after that, Vera found him in his room and asked him to come with her without explaining where. He followed. A smaller room, lower floor. A table with a cloth already laid over something. 2 of Aurelius's security staff stood at the edges, faces tight. Vera lifted the cloth. A wine glass, half empty, dark red. She said nothing but watched his face. Selim looked at it and then at her. She handed him a folded note, not from a notepad, from a proper document fold. Official heading at the top. He opened it. Read it. His name was on it. His name, signed at the bottom of an order authorizing the acquisition of a particular vintage from a restricted supplier. A supplier flagged in the court records for use in documented poisoning incidents. He had never signed anything. He had never been anywhere near this document. But the signature looked like him. It looked exactly like him. They locked the room at 9 that night. Not with chains. Not with visible bolts. Just a quiet, polite knock from Vera. A soft for your safety. The door will be secured until the investigation concludes. And then the sound of the lock catching. Soft. Final. Selim sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the floor. The investigation. That word had been used 3 times in the past 4 hours. First by the security staff. Then by one of Aurelius's advisors who appeared at his door long enough to say it. Then by Vera. Nobody had said his name alongside an accusation directly. They didn't need to. His name was on the document. The document sat in an official file. The file had been submitted to the court steward before the end of the reception. By morning, every person in that building would have heard. He thought about writing a denial. He had the notepad, the pen. He could write clearly, precisely, in detail. He put the notepad down. Words on paper from the person being accused weren't evidence. They were noise. The staff who passed his room that first evening had moved differently. Not rude, nobody was rude. But the brief eye contact that Vera's team had offered him over the previous 4 days was gone now. I slid past. Footsteps picked up pace just slightly when they moved by his door. Distance. Collective, quiet, unanimous distance. He stood at the window and watched the courtyard below. Still lit. The same positions as before. The security presence Aurelius had added, still there. But now Selim couldn't tell if they were there to keep threats out, or to keep him in. By the second day, the advisor stopped appearing at his door. By the third day, Vera's visits shortened to 60 seconds. Food delivered. Tray collected. Gone. By the fourth day, Aurelius had not come. Had not written. Had not sent word. Nothing. And that silence, 4 days of it, did something that the accusation alone hadn't managed. Created doubt. Not in other people's minds. In Selim's. He sat at the desk on the 4th evening and, for the first time since arriving at this estate, let himself think the thought he'd been avoiding. What if he had been brought here specifically to end up exactly here? Not positioned for a strategy. Positioned for a fall. What if the faction Aurelius described wasn't the enemy? What if the document wasn't planted to frame Selim by outside forces, but arranged to frame him by the people he'd been trusting? What if being labeled worthless his entire life had made him the perfect candidate not for survival, but for sacrifice? He opened the notepad, wrote nothing, closed it. Around midnight, the courtyard below went dark. One by one the exterior lights cut off the way they did every night. He had memorized the sequence by now. East wing first, then south path, then the main gate lanterns. He watched it happen. Then he heard them. Footsteps in the corridor outside. Not Vera's pace. Too slow. Too deliberate. Stopping just outside his door. He didn't move. The steps had the weight and patience of someone who wasn't in a hurry. Because they knew the door was already locked. Selim stood. Moved toward the center of the room. Every nerve in his body held still. Silence. Then nothing. The footsteps didn't leave. They just stopped. Right outside. Present and unmoving like pressure through a wall. 30 seconds. A minute. Then the door opened. He braced. It wasn't Aurelius. It wasn't Vera. It wasn't any staff member he'd seen before. The man who stepped through the doorway was broad-shouldered, silver-haired, dressed in civilian clothing that couldn't quite hide the authority underneath it. He smiled. The same smile from the reception. Calloway. He stepped inside without asking, closed the door behind him, and said quietly, "We need to talk." Calloway didn't sit down. That was the first thing Selim noticed. A man who had just walked through a locked door. Uninvited, unannounced, in the middle of the night, and he wasn't nervous. Wasn't rushed. He stood in the center of the room like he'd been given a key, like the space already belonged to him, and just waited for Selim to stop staring. Selim didn't reach for his notepad. Not yet. Calloway looked around the room slowly. The desk, the window, the tray from dinner, barely touched. His eyes moved the way a man's eyes move when he's confirming what he already knows. Then he looked at Selim. "You figured it out yet?" he asked. Selim picked up the notepad. Wrote, "How did you get in here?" Calloway glanced at the note and smiled. "The same way I get into most places. Through people who owe me something." He pulled the chair from the desk, Selim's chair, and sat down in it without being invited. "Sit, please. What I'm about to tell you is going to be a lot to take in, and you look like you've been standing for 4 days." Selim didn't sit. Calloway shrugged. Continued anyway. "You think the document was planted by my people." He said it plainly. Not a question. "You've been locked in here running through it. Wondering why Aurelius hasn't come. Wondering if the entire thing, the purchase, the positioning, all of it was set up from the start." He paused. "You're not wrong to wonder." Selim's pen touched the notepad. Calloway kept going before he could write anything. "I've watched Aurelius Hale operate for 11 years. You know what makes him effective?" He leaned forward slightly. "He never uses anyone he values. He uses people nobody will miss. People nobody will question. People who arrive carrying a reputation so low that even their protest sounds like noise." He let that sit. "Does that description sound familiar to you?" Selim's jaw tightened. He wrote, "Why are you here?" "Because I'm the only person in this building who's going to tell you the truth tonight." Calloway's voice dropped. Not dramatically, just lower, the way people speak when they want to make sure a room's 4 walls are the only things listening. "You were never meant to survive this. That document exists for one reason, to give Aurelius a clean exit when the court pushes back." He hands them you, the infertile, unmatched Omega with no bloodline influence and no allies. The court gets a face to blame. The real operation continues. And you, he paused. You disappear. Quietly. The way inconvenient people always do in houses like this. The room felt suddenly very still. Calloway stood. Moved toward the door. "I'm not asking you to trust me," he said, one hand resting on the door frame. "I'm asking you to use your eyes." He reached into his jacket, withdrew a folded document, set it on the desk. "Read that when I leave. Then decide who's protecting you and who's been arranging your exit since before you arrived." He left. The lock didn't catch this time. Selim stood alone. For a long moment he didn't move. Then he crossed to the desk, picked up the document, unfolded it. It was a communication record. Internal. Court letterhead at the top. 3 weeks old. Dated before Selim had ever set foot in this building. At the bottom, in the signature block, Aurelius Hale. And beneath it, a single line of instruction. Proceed with the Voss acquisition. Position for exposure. Accept the outcome. Accept the outcome. Selim read it 3 times. Set it down. His hands were steady. But something behind his sternum, that last thin piece of something he'd been protecting since the auction hall, went very, very quiet. 5 days of silence. Then Aurelius walked through the door like those 5 days hadn't happened. No knock. No warning. He simply appeared in the doorway at 7 in the morning, dressed like someone who had already been awake for hours, and looked at Selim the way you look at something you've been thinking about from a distance. Selim was already at the desk. He didn't stand. He reached for the notepad, but not to write a greeting. He turned it around and pushed it across the desk so Aurelius could read what was already on the page. The document Calloway had left was beside it, unfolded, facing up. Aurelius looked at it. His expression didn't collapse, didn't harden. He read it, looked at Selim, then pulled the second chair from the corner. Not Selim's chair this time, and sat down. He reached for the notepad. Wrote, "Where did you get this?" Selim took the pad back. Wrote, "Does it matter?" Aurelius looked at the question, set the pen down, picked it back up. Wrote, "It matters because that document is a forgery, and I need to know who built it." Selim stared at him. Wrote, "It has your signature." Aurelius, "Yes." Selim, "Your letterhead, your date stamp." Aurelius, "Yes." Selim's pen pressed harder into the paper than he intended. Wrote, "Then explain it." Aurelius sat back, looked at the ceiling for 3 seconds, then leaned forward and wrote. Not quickly, but with the kind of careful pacing that meant he was choosing every word. "For 8 months, we have known there is a person inside this estate feeding information to Calloway's network. Not a guard, not a low-level staff member. Someone with access to official documentation, letter stock, and signature files. We didn't know who. We needed to find out." Selim read it. Wrote, "And you needed someone they'd go after." Aurelius, "Someone they believed was vulnerable enough to approach. Low enough value that moving against them wouldn't raise flags." Selim felt something cold move through his chest. Wrote, "You let them lock me in here." Aurelius, "Yes." Selim, "You let the staff..." No apology wrapped around it. No softening. Just the truth, sitting there between them like a stone on a table. Selim absorbed it, then wrote, "And now?" Aurelius looked at the question for a long moment. Wrote, "Now I need you to understand something." He turned the notepad around. "I knew what Calloway would do once he got to you. I knew what document he would use. I knew what he would say, because every piece of that came from the same person inside this house." He underlined the next line twice. "We have them now, because of how they moved against you, because of every step they took to build that frame." Selim read it, sat with it, then wrote the only question left. "But not for the reason I think?" Aurelius looked at that line. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, not quite not one. He wrote, "Not even close." The name was Daphne Osei, 34 years old, court records administrator, 11 years with the Hale estate. The kind of staff member who became invisible not through neglect but through consistency, always present, always reliable, never drawing attention in any direction. Perfect cover. Aurelius laid it out across the desk in Selim's room at 8 that morning. Documents, communication logs, access records, a timeline that ran back 22 months. He didn't present it dramatically. He just spread it out and let Selim read through it. Took 40 minutes. By the end, Selim understood the full shape of it. Daphne had been feeding Calloway's network internal schedules, security rotation details, and draft correspondence for nearly 2 years. Small pieces, regularly delivered, the kind of intelligence gathering that doesn't look like intelligence gathering until you map it all at once. The forged document, Aurelius's letterhead, his signature, the instruction to accept the outcome. That had been Daphne's construction. She had the access. She had the materials. And she had, apparently, the patience. But here was the part that mattered. Here was the piece Selim hadn't seen coming. Calloway didn't know Daphne was compromised. Aurelius's team had identified her 4 months ago. Not immediately, it took time, cross-referencing access logs, tracing document prints to specific terminals. But once they found her, they made a choice. They didn't remove her. They watched her. And they fed her. Carefully selected information. Just enough to keep Calloway's network confident. Just enough to make the network move in specific, traceable patterns. Every piece of disinformation Daphne passed along shaped a response on Calloway's end. A resource request here, a meeting arranged there, a message sent to a contact who didn't know he was being recorded. 22 months of work. Mapped, documented, filed. And Selim. His arrival, his perceived worthlessness, the controlled chaos of the frame attempt, had been the final piece. Not bait in the way he first understood it. Not bait to expose Selim. Bait to make Calloway's network commit fully. To force them to use their best tool, Daphne, at maximum exposure. To create a chain of actions so visible, so documented, that no court in the country could argue it away. Selim set the last document down, sat quietly, then wrote, "You secretly kept me safe the entire time. Aurelius, from the moment you arrived. Selim, the security I noticed. The positions, Aurelius, were specifically structured around your location. You were never unwatched. Selim, even when Calloway got into this room, Aurelius, there were 3 people in the corridor outside. Calloway was followed from the moment he entered the East Wing." Selim wrote slowly, "Then why didn't you tell me any of this before it happened?" Aurelius picked up the pen. He wrote, "Because the network was watching your face, your body, how you held yourself in that room with Calloway. If you had known he was being monitored, if you had known the document was a forgery, even by 1 degree your reactions would have shifted. And they read those shifts." He paused before the next line. "I needed your confusion to be real, your doubt to be real, your fear to be real, not performance. Real." Selim stared at the page, then wrote, "You needed me to actually break. Aurelius, I needed you to actually respond." There was a difference in those 2 things. Small, but real. Selim wrote, "And Daphne, Aurelius, in custody. Since last night. Selim, Calloway, Aurelius, court assembly. Tomorrow morning." The word tomorrow had weight. Selim looked at it on the page. Selim counted them from the doorway before he stepped in. He didn't know why he counted. Something to do with his hands. Something to do with the part of him that still needed facts to hold on to when everything else felt like it was moving too fast. 63 people. 20 of them advisors. The rest, court members, legal stewards, senior household staff. Every seat filled. No one late. No one casual. The room knew something was happening. They just didn't know what yet. Selim walked to his designated position near the left side of the central floor. Vera had told him where to stand. Not close to Aurelius. Not far. Visible. That was the instruction. Be visible. Don't move unless addressed. He could do that. Aurelius opened the session without ceremony. Brief. Factual. Evidence presented in sequence. Not as a dramatic reveal but as a methodical record. Communication logs first. Then access records. Then the timeline. The room was quiet. Not politely quiet. Tightly quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when 63 people are all processing something at the same speed and none of them are ready to be the first to speak. Calloway sat in the 4th row. He had arrived composed. Pressed suit, silver hair, the same immovable smile from the reception. He watched the evidence roll out with the expression of a man attending a lecture on a topic he found mildly inconvenient. until the communication logs hit the floor. His logs. Then the composure shifted. Not broke, shifted. Like a building that's still standing, but you can now see the cracks running up the side. The court steward read 3 excerpts aloud. Date stamps. Recipients. Subjects. The third one, named Daphne Osei, directly instructed her to produce the document with specific language, specific signature elements, a specific target name. The target name was Selim Voss. The room exhaled. Not loudly, just pressure releasing. And then Calloway stood up. That surprised people. You could see it move through the room. A slight lean forward, a slight shift in posture across multiple rows. He didn't look panicked. He looked at Selim. Directly. This document chain, he said, voice even carrying well in the space, was produced by a network operating under directives from this estate. The logs before you have been selectively curated to frame a man who was himself attempting to expose a compromised acquisition. He let that land. Then, Selim Voss arrived at this estate under documented false pretenses. His placement here was engineered. The timeline of this framing begins not with my communication, but with the decision to bring him here. Murmuring now, low, fretting. One of the advisors in the second row turned to another. Calloway kept going. I am asking this court to consider, before accepting this evidence as presented, who benefits from Selim Voss being here, who profits from his silence, and who, in this room, arranged his position before he ever walked through those doors. The murmur thickened. Selim felt the weight of it. Not abstract, physical. The way a room's collective doubt has actual mass when you're standing at the center of it. He looked to Aurelius. Aurelius stood at the front of the room. Still. Watching. Not the court. Watching Selim. And in that moment, in the specific, deliberate steadiness of Aurelius's gaze, Selim understood. This was it. This was the moment Aurelius had been building toward. Not the evidence. Not Daphne's arrest. Not Calloway's logs. This, Selim standing in a room full of doubt with the whole court watching, and choosing what to do next. Aurelius stepped back. One step. Visible. Intentional. He wasn't gonna carry this. 63 people looked at Selim. Waiting. And Selim reached into his jacket pocket. Not for his notepad. For something else. He pulled out a drive. Small. Black. The kind you'd overlook in a coat pocket. He held it up. Not theatrically. Just held it up so the room could see it, so nobody missed the fact that it existed, that it was in his hand, that he had arrived with it. Then he walked to the evidence table at the front of the room. Set it down in front of the court steward. Turned. Faced the room. And for the first time since this whole thing began, Selim didn't reach for a notepad. He didn't write anything. He just stood there, visible, steady, present, and let the drive do what a notepad never could. The steward plugged it in. The display screen at the front of the hall came to life. Audio recordings, 26 of them, dated and time-stamped, running across the past 8 months. Internal meetings, private phone calls, a dinner conversation recorded in what sounded like a restaurant, where 2 men discussed, in clean and comfortable detail, the plan to destabilize the Hale estate from within. Starting with the acquisition of a low-value Omega, nobody would think twice about losing. Every word, clearly spoken. One of the voices belonged to Calloway. The other, and this was the part the room did not see coming, the other voice belonged to Lord Aldrich Pruitt, senior court advisor, 27 years of service, seated in the second row. The one who had turned to whisper to the man beside him less than 4 minutes ago. The room cracked open. Not chaos clarity. The kind of sharp, sudden clarity that only lands when a truth has been held back long enough that its release hits everything at once. Aldrich Pruitt stood up, sat back down, looked at nothing. Calloway turned once toward the exit. 2 of Aurelius's security staff were already there. The recordings kept playing. Selim stood at the front of the room and let them play all the way through. Every voice, every date, every casual sentence spoken by men who believed that being careful meant being untouchable. They had not been careful enough. When the last recording ended, The room was completely still. Not tightly quiet the way it had been at the start. This was different. This was the quiet of a room that has just watched a structure collapse in real time and hasn't finished understanding what it means yet. The court steward looked at the chief legal officer. The chief legal officer looked at Aurelius. Aurelius looked at Selim, and Selim sat down, not collapsing, not bowing, just sitting. The way someone sits when they've been standing for a very long time and have finally decided they've earned the chair. The proceedings moved swiftly after that. Calloway and Pruitt were formally detained before the session closed. Daphne Osei's cooperation agreement, already filed, was read into the record. The forged document bearing Aurelius's signature was struck. The investigation file on Selim was closed. 3 words. Charges dismissed. Cleared. Vera was standing near the wall. She gave him one look. Not quite a smile, but close. That evening, Aurelius came to the room. No security. No advisors. Just him. He sat across the desk. Pushed the notepad to Selim's side. Not his own. Selim looked at him. Picked up the pen. Waited. Aurelius didn't reach for the notepad. He spoke. Out loud, directly, the way he hadn't done in this room before. You could have given that drive to Calloway when he came to your room. He probably offered you a way out. Selim wrote, he offered me freedom, Aurelius, and you chose this instead. Selim set the pen down, thought about that, picked it back up, wrote, he offered me an exit. That's not the same thing as freedom. Aurelius was quiet. Then he said, there's a choice in front of you now, a real one. You can leave this estate. Full documentation of your clearance, resources, transportation, whatever you need. You walk out clean. Everything that happened here stays on record in your favor. Selim wrote, and the second option? You stay. Not as a position piece. Not as a resource. A pause. As someone who has earned a seat at a table that very few people ever get access to. That comes with risk. And it comes with me, which is its own complicated thing. The corner of his mouth moved. I won't pretend otherwise. Selim looked at the desk for a long moment. Not the notepad. Not the documents. Just the desk. The room. The window with the courtyard outside. He had arrived here with nothing. No choice about the sale. No choice about the position. No choice about the frame or the isolation or the 5 days in a locked room being slowly convinced he was already gone. Every single thing had been decided for him. Until now. He picked up the pen. He wrote one line. Turned the notepad around. Aurelius read it. Something shifted in his face. Quiet, real. The first fully unguarded expression Selim had seen on him. The note said, I'm not leaving because someone said I could. I'm staying because I decided to. Aurelius set the notepad down. Didn't write anything back. Didn't need to. Outside the window, the estate was lit up against the dark. Steady, solid, still standing. Everything that had tried to move against it now sitting in holding rooms or removed from record books. The court would take weeks to fully process what had shifted. But in this room, in this quiet, something had already finished settling. Selim had arrived as a liability. He left that room as none of those things. He left it as himself. And for the first time in 22 years, nobody had arranged that. If you made it all the way here, you already know this story was never just about power. It was about what happens when someone keeps going after everyone around them decides they won't. Drop a comment below. Tell me, what was the moment that hit you hardest? Was it the auction hall? The locked room? Or that final line? Your thoughts live in the comments, and they matter more than you know. If the story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Every story on this channel is built to remind you that silence is not the same as weakness, and that the people written off first are often the ones who change everything in the end. More stories are coming. Don't miss them.